The last good day began with the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth, a perfume that, for Dr. Eris Thorne, was more comforting than any Chanel. She was a geologist, a woman who read stories in strata and saw history in the grain of a rock. The Uinta Mountains of Utah were her cathedral, and this morning she was taking her son Leo to morning service. At 6 years old, Leo was a bundle of kinetic energy, his small hiking boots already scuffed with the dust of a dozen prior adventures. Eris watched him scramble over a fallen log, his laughter echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. She was, by nature and profession, a competent idealist. She believed in preparedness, in knowledge, in the elegant logic of the natural world. Her pack was a testament to this faith. GPS with extra batteries, a satellite phone for true emergencies, a meticulously assembled first aid kit, water purifier, high-energy snacks, and her favorite custom-forged geology hammer, its steel head balanced perfectly against its hickory handle. She had mapped their route, a moderate 4-mile loop that promised views of the Mirror Lake Highway, and a small, jewel-like tarn nestled in a granite cirque. She knew the weather forecast, the local flora and fauna, the specific type of Proterozoic quartzite that formed the dramatic ridges around them. She was not a tourist here. She was a parishioner in her own church, and she believed with a quiet certainty that competence was a shield against chaos. The bond with her son was the core of her world, a gravitational force more powerful than any geological upheaval. She saw her own curiosity reflected in his wide, brown eyes as he'd point to a lichen-splattered boulder and ask, "Mommy, how old is this rock?" She wouldn't just say, "Very old." She would kneel, her own eyes level with his, and explain, "This lichen, the green stuff, it grows very, very slowly, maybe as slow as your fingernail. And look how big it is. This rock was probably sitting right here just like this before the first people ever walked this trail, before the pioneers came, even before the Vikings sailed their ships." He would listen, rapt, his small hand tracing the rough texture of the granite. It was in these moments that she felt a sense of profound success that dwarfed any academic citation or published paper. She was not just teaching him geology, she was teaching him to see the world as a place of deep time and intricate connection. An hour into their hike, they reached a small overlook. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern peaks, bathing the landscape in a soft, ethereal gold. Aris took out her phone. She framed Leo against the epic backdrop, his face bright with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child in the wild. He was holding up a piece of fool's gold pyrite that she'd helped him find, grinning a toothy, triumphant smile. She snapped the picture. Then she typed a quick message to her husband Ben back at their rented cabin. "Morning from the top of the world. My little prospector struck gold." She attached the photo and hit send. The message delivered instantly, a small, satisfying chime in the vast silence. She imagined Ben, still half asleep, seeing the photo and smiling. It was a digital thread connecting their small, happy family, and a proof of life and love sent from 9,000 feet. She put the phone away, zipped it into an inner pocket of her pack, and ruffled Leo's hair. "Come on, buddy, let's see if we can find the lake." Back in the cabin, the smell of fresh coffee filled the small kitchen. Ben Thorne, a graphic designer whose world was one of pixels and Pantone colors, looked at the photo on his phone for the 10th time. Eris, silhouetted slightly by the rising sun, had one hand on Leo's shoulder. Leo himself was a blur of jubilant energy, a tiny figure against a truly colossal landscape. Ben smiled. He saved the image, his heart swelling with a familiar, comfortable warmth. They were good, this little unit of his. Aris was the anchor, the brilliant, steady force, and Leo was their shared joy. He told her not to wake him, to just go and enjoy the mountain sunrise she loved so much. They were due back by 10 a.m. for a late breakfast of pancakes, a Thorne family tradition on the last day of vacation. He checked the time. 8:15 a.m. He poured another cup of coffee and opened his laptop, intending to get a little work done. The hours at first passed unnoticed, measured in the quiet clicks of his mouse and the soft tapping of his keyboard. At 9:45, he glanced at the clock and felt a small, pleasant flutter of anticipation. Time to start the pancake batter. He pulled out the flour and eggs, humming to himself. By 10:10, the batter was ready. The griddle was hot, but the driveway was empty. A flicker of something, not yet annoyance, not yet worry, but a subtle recalibration of his mood. She was probably just showing Leo one last rock, he thought. Eris ran on geological time sometimes, 10:30. The griddle was off now, the batter sitting on the counter. He walked to the front window and stared down the empty gravel road. The rational part of his brain began supplying explanations, a buffet of plausible scenarios. Leo probably got a blister, and they were moving slow. They met another family on the trail and got to talking. Eris found an interesting outcropping and lost track of time, her geologist's brain captivated. Each thought was a small, flimsy barricade against the creeping dread that was beginning to seep in at the edges of his consciousness. At 11 o'clock, the barricades began to crumble. This wasn't like her. Eris was meticulous. Punctual to a fault, especially where Leo's safety or schedule was concerned, he tried her phone. It went straight to voicemail. The sound of the automated message, a voice that was hers but not her, was suddenly jarring, alien. He paced the small cabin from the window to the kitchen to the window again. The sun was higher now, the light harsher. The beautiful mountain landscape outside the window started to feel menacing, its vastness no longer sublime but threatening. The silence of the cabin was deafening. He could hear his own breathing, the frantic pounding of his own heart. By 11:45, the dread was no longer creeping. It was a flood. The rationalizations were gone, washed away by a torrent of horrific images, a fall, a twisted ankle in a remote spot, a sudden, unexpected encounter with wildlife. He grabbed his keys, his mind a frantic mess. Drive to the trailhead? Call someone? Who? His hands were shaking. He felt a profound, paralyzing helplessness. He was a man of screens and software, not of wilderness and emergencies. At 12:05 p.m., sitting in his car at the trailhead parking lot, seeing her SUV sitting there cold and empty, the last vestiges of denial evaporated. This was real. He fumbled for his phone, his thumb slipping on the screen. He dialed 911. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, a stark contrast to the ragged terror in his own. Summit County, 911, what is your emergency? Ben's voice was a choked whisper. My wife and my son. They went for a hike this morning. They were supposed to be back hours ago. They're not back. He gave the operator Eris's name, Leo's name, the trail they were on. Each word felt like a betrayal, an admission that the perfect, happy world he'd woken up in had fractured beyond recognition. The operator's calm, improcedural questions were both a comfort and a torment. Yes, he knew what she was wearing. Yes, she was experienced. Yes, she had a pack. No, she had no known medical conditions. The call ended with a promise that a deputy was on the way. Ben hung up and sat in the profound silence of his car, staring at Eris's empty vehicle. The photo she had sent him just 5 hours earlier, the proof of life from the top of the world, now felt like a message from a ghost. The response was immediate and immense, an army summoned to fight a ghost. Within an hour of Ben's call, the Mirror Lake Highway trailhead had transformed from a quiet tourist spot into a bustling incident command post. Summit County Search and Rescue, a volunteer force of seasoned mountaineers, skiers, and emergency medics, arrived first, their personal trucks and SUVs bristling with gear. They were quickly followed by county sheriff's deputies who cordoned off the area with yellow tape that seemed garishly bright against the muted greens and grays of the forest. By nightfall, the operation had swelled. The Utah Department of Public Safety helicopter, its rotors beating a rhythmic, percussive sound against the canyon walls, began making low passes, its powerful searchlight cutting a stark white cone through the deepening twilight. The mobilization was a study in practiced efficiency. A large trailer, the mobile command center, was parked and powered up. Inside, beneath the hum of generators and the crackle of radios, a search grid was being laid over a massive topographical map of the area. The 4-mile loop Oris had planned was the epicenter. But the search radius expanded outward in concentric circles, each sector assigned a number and a team. The methodology was a science unto itself, a grim geometry imposed upon the chaos of the wilderness. Teams on the ground were organized into units of 3 or 4, each with a radio and a GPS tracker. They were instructed to move in sweeping lines, maintaining visual contact, their eyes scanning every log, every crevice, every thicket of brush. The protocol was precise. Call out Eris's name, then Leo's, then pause for 30 seconds of listening. Repeat every 5 minutes. The sheer scale of the Uintas, however, made a mockery of their efforts. The terrain was a brutal mix of dense pine forest, treacherous talus slopes where rocks shifted underfoot like broken teeth, and sudden steep-sided drainages choked with impenetrable willows. The aerial sweeps, so effective in open country, were largely nullified by the thick forest canopy. The helicopter's advanced thermal imaging camera, designed to detect body heat, was rendered almost useless by the residual warmth of sun-baked rocks and the dense foliage that masked everything below. Specialized K9 units were brought in, their handlers giving the dogs a scent article, one of Leo's T-shirts from the cabin. The dogs, miracles of breeding and training, worked with a frantic energy, their noses to the ground, but the afternoon winds had scoured the trail, and the scent was diffuse, scattered, impossible to follow for more than a few hundred yards before it vanished completely into the vast, overwhelming olfactory noise of the forest. One of the searchers, a man named Dave Jensen, who'd been volunteering with SAR for 15 years, found himself in a drainage choked with alders about a mile off the main trail. It was day 2 of the search. The initial adrenaline and professional focus had given way to a grinding, frustrating fatigue. The air was thick with biting flies and the sweet, cloying smell of damp vegetation. Every step was a struggle, pushing through whipping branches that tore at his clothes and skin. He and his team had been assigned Sector 7 Bravo, a steep, unforgiving piece of land that no sane hiker would ever willingly enter. But the logic of a search is to assume the illogical. A fall, a disorientation, a panicked flight. So they searched. "Eris!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. He waited, listening to the buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves. "Ah, Leo!" The name came out softer, a plea. The silence that answered was absolute, profound. It felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, a heavy, indifferent entity that swallowed their calls whole. He looked at the faces of his teammates. They were etched with the same frustration, the same growing sense of hopelessness. They had found nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, not a dropped water bottle, not a single thread of clothing. It was as if a geologist and her 6-year-old son had stepped off the trail and been erased from the physical world. The sheer lack of any sign was what was so unnerving. Accidents leave traces. Panic leaves a trail of discarded gear. But this was a void. It was an army fighting a ghost, firing their weapons of expertise and technology into an emptiness that simply absorbed it all without a ripple. Ben Thorne spent those first few days in a state of suspended animation at the command post. He existed on lukewarm coffee and the bitter taste of fear. He watched the searchers, these grim-faced, competent strangers, head out in the morning and return, exhausted and empty-handed, at dusk. The lead investigator, a sheriff's detective named Marcus Cole, was a patient, weary-looking man in his 50s. He treated Ben with a gentle professionalism that felt both kind and excruciatingly distant. "We're regridding the eastern slopes today, Ben," Cole would say, pointing to the massive map. "The chopper is going to focus on the basins above the tree line." Ben would nod, the technical jargon washing over him. He felt like a ghost himself, haunting the edges of the operation, a civilian irrelevance in a world of professionals. He'd stare at the map for hours, his eyes tracing the red-inked lines of the completed search sectors. It looked like a bleeding wound on the landscape. He would listen to the radio chatter, trying to decipher the codes, praying for a break in the monotonous stream of sector clear and nothing to report. The worst moments were when a searcher would come over to him directly, their face a mask of practiced sympathy. "We're doing everything we can, sir," they'd say. And he knew they were. He could see it in their sweat-stained clothes and their exhausted eyes. But the combined force of their expertise, their courage, and their technology was proving utterly powerless. They were an army, and they were losing the war against an enemy they couldn't even see. He was trapped in a procedural nightmare, a bystander to the most important event of his life, watching an army of experts confirm, hour by painstaking hour, that his wife and son had simply vanished. On the fourth day, a crack of light appeared in the suffocating darkness. A team searching a steep, rocky chute nearly 3 miles south of the main trail, far from any logical route, found something. It was a small piece of fabric of vibrant turquoise blue, snagged on the thorny branch of a wild currant bush. The team leader photographed it in situ, carefully placed it in an evidence bag, and radioed it in. The effect at the command post was electric. Detective Cole brought the bagged fabric to Ben. "Does this look familiar?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ben's heart hammered against his ribs. The color. It was the exact shade of the windbreaker Eris had been wearing. He remembered her buying it, calling it her happy jacket. "Yes," he breathed, his voice trembling. "That's hers. That's from her jacket." A wave of collective relief, of renewed purpose, washed through the command center. A theory, swift and compelling, took hold. She must have fallen, perhaps from the ridge above. She'd become disoriented, stumbled miles in the wrong direction, and ended up in this remote, treacherous terrain. The fabric was the first breadcrumb on a trail they had until now failed to find. The false hope was intoxicating, a powerful drug after days of despair. For Ben, it was a lifeline. He pictured Eris, hurt but alive, waiting for rescue. He imagined holding Leo again. The images were so vivid. He so desperately needed that they felt like premonitions. The search, which had been on the verge of being scaled back, was re-energized with a vengeance. Resources were immediately reallocated. The grid map was wiped clean, and a new, intensely focused search area was drawn, centered on the chute where the fabric was found. Teams that had been combing the northern sectors were pulled and redeployed, converging on this new zone of promise. The helicopter abandoned its wide, sweeping patterns and began making tight, methodical passes over the southern ridges. K-9 units were brought back, given the new fabric to scent, and sent into the dense undergrowth of the new sector. For 2 more days, the Army threw itself at this new objective. The terrain was brutal, some of the worst in the entire range. Our searchers rappelled down cliff faces and hacked their way through impenetrable thickets. They meticulously combed every square foot of the new grid, their hope warring with the punishing reality of the landscape. Ben waited, caught in a terrible limbo, his entire being focused on the crackle of the radio. The debunking came not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet, soul-crushing report from the State Crime Lab. The fabric had been rushed for analysis. The initial report was inconclusive. It was a common nylon blend, but the second report from the forensics team was definitive. Microscopic analysis of the fibers and the dirt embedded within them showed long-term exposure to UV radiation and multiple seasons of weather. The fabric had been snagged on that bush for at least a year, perhaps longer. It couldn't have belonged to Eris. It was a ghost clue, a random piece of litter that had sent the entire massive operation on a costly and heartbreakingly futile detour. The news landed at the command post with the force of a physical blow. The energy, the hope, the sense of purpose, it all evaporated, replaced by a stunned, bitter silence. Detective Cole had the agonizing task of telling Ben. He delivered the news with a quiet, almost paternal sadness. Ben didn't rage. He didn't cry. He simply deflated, the fragile architecture of his hope collapsing into dust. The logistical fallout was swift. The massive search was officially suspended. A smaller, limited, continuous search would remain in place, but the Army was demobilized. The command post was dismantled, the maps were folded, the professionals went home. The yellow tape was taken down. The trailhead returned to being a quiet spot for tourists, the ground littered with the faint footprints of an army that had fought a ghost and lost. For Ben Thorne, the silence that descended was worse than the noise of the search. It was the sound of the world giving up. 5 years passed. The world, as it is designed to do, moved on. The seasons turned in the Winter Mountains. Snow fell and melted. Wildflowers bloomed and withered. The case of the missing geologist and her son faded from the headlines, becoming a piece of local lore, a cautionary tale whispered to hikers at the trailhead. For Ben Thorne, however, time had not passed. It had simply accumulated, like layers of silt burying him in place. He still lived in the same house, but it was no longer a home. It was a museum of a lost life. Every object a relic, every room an echo chamber of memory. The public, and even some in law enforcement, had settled on a comfortable, if tragic, narrative. Eris Thorne, for all her expertise, had been overconfident. She had pushed her luck, taken a small child into a vast wilderness, and the wilderness, in its indifferent way, had claimed them. It was a story of human hubris punished by nature. It was simple, clean, and required no further investigation. It was a story Ben refused to accept. The lack of evidence, the complete and total vanishing, gnawed at him. Nature, however brutal, always leaves a mess. A fall leaves broken bones. An animal attack leaves remains. A simple case of getting lost leaves a trail of discarded items. This was different. This was an erasure. And so, in the long, silent vigil that his life had become, he fought back. He was no longer the helpless civilian at the command post. He had become the keeper of the truth, the sole warrior against the false narrative. His battlefields was a spare bedroom he had converted into his own private incident command center. The walls were covered in topographical maps, crisscrossed with his own notes and theories drawn in red marker. He'd spent thousands of hours and a significant portion of his savings transforming himself into an expert. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the entire case file, and he read every page, every report, every witness statement until the words were burned into his memory. His greatest weapon was a website he had built, finderisthorne.com. It was a stark, somber, and meticulously detailed repository of everything known about the case. He uploaded the photos, the timelines, the maps of the search grids. He wrote long analytical posts dissecting the search's failures, pointing out the inconsistencies. He created a forum where other amateur sleuths and concerned strangers could post their own theories. He spent hours each night moderating the comments, responding to emails, chasing down the faintest of leads, most of which led to cranks or psychics. It was a lonely, obsessive crusade. One evening, he found himself on the phone with Marcus Cole, the now retired detective. Ben had found a discrepancy in 2 different search team logs from day 1, and he couldn't let it go. Marcus, Team 4 Alpha's log says they cleared the western ridge of the basin at 1600 hours, Ben said, his voice tight with an intensity that had become his new normal. but Team 4 Bravo's GPS track shows they were at least a half-mile east of there at the same time. There's a gap. A whole section of that ridge was never physically searched on foot. There was a weary sigh on the other end of the line. "Ben," Cole said, his voice heavy with a familiar mix of pity and exasperation. "We've been over this. The chopper made a low pass with the thermal imager over that exact section. It was clear." "The thermal was useless under the canopy, you know that?" Ben shot back, his frustration boiling over. "It was a gap. It's right here in your own paperwork." The conversation ended as it always did, with Cole promising to look at it, a gentle dismissal that Ben knew was meaningless. He hung up the phone and stared at the smiling photo of Eris and Leo on his desk. His grief was a strange and complex thing now. It was no longer the raw, open wound of the first year. It had become a part of his cellular structure, a constant low-grade ache. But woven into it was something else, a stubborn, illogical, and utterly unbreakable thread of hope. It wasn't the hope that they were alive, after 5 years that fantasy was a cruelty he could no longer afford. It was a different kind of hope. It was the hope for an answer. The hope that one day the world would be forced to look again, to see the flaw in its easy narrative, and to finally find them. He believed in evidence. Aris had taught him that. And he believed with the certainty of a zealot that the evidence was still out there, waiting in the silence. The unlikely messengers were 2 amateur botanists from Salt Lake City, Chloe and Liam. A young couple in their late 20s who found more joy in identifying rare sedges than in frequenting trendy bars. Their passion had brought them to a remote and unglamorous corner of the Uintas, a dry, sun-scorched wash miles from any designated trail. They were hunting for Cryptantha breviflora, a tiny, elusive wildflower known to grow in the specific alkaline soil of these forgotten drainages. The area was not beautiful in a conventional sense. It was a landscape of cracked earth, scrubby sagebrush, and bleached, skeletal-looking junipers. It was the kind of place people drove past not to. Liam was on his hands and knees, his face close to the ground, examining a promising patch of soil with a hand lens. Chloe was scanning the banks of the wash, her eyes peeled for the telltale grayish-green leaves of their quarry. It was the glint of sun on metal that caught her eye. At first she dismissed it as a piece of a discarded can, another sad bit of litter in the backcountry. But something about it was different. It wasn't the thin, crumpled shine of aluminum. It was a solid, focused gleam. Curiosity piqued, she scrambled down the loose scree of the washbank. The object was half buried in the silt and gravel that had been deposited by some long-past flash flood. She knelt and began to dig at the impacted dirt with her fingers. First, a smooth-shaped piece of wood emerged. Then, the cold, heavy density of a steel head. She pulled it free. It was a hammer. But unlike any she'd seen before, it was a geologist's hammer with one flat face and one pointed pick end. It was rusted in places, the wooden handle weathered and gray, but it was clearly a tool of quality, its design purposeful and elegant. "Liam, come look at this," she called. He came over, brushing the dust from his knees. He took the hammer from her. It had a surprising weight, a satisfying heft. "That's a rock hammer," he said. "An Estwing looks like, or a custom job. Somebody was probably out here prospecting." They stood there for a moment in the oppressive heat, the hammer feeling strangely significant in their hands. Their internal debate began almost immediately. It was probably nothing. Someone just dropped it years ago. They should just leave it. Reporting it would be a hassle. Driving to the nearest town, finding the sheriff's office, filling out paperwork. It would eat up their whole day, their rare weekend away from the city. But as Chloe looked at the hammer again, she noticed something. There were initials, faint but clear, carved into the base of the hickory handle, a T. The object suddenly felt less like a lost tool and more like a lost story. A person had carved those initials. A person had held this handle. It felt wrong to just toss it aside. "We should report it," Chloe said, her voice firm. "What if it's important? What if someone was looking for it?" The journey to the small town of Camas took over an hour. The sheriff's substation was a small, unassuming brick building next to the town hall. The deputy at the front desk was young, with a bored expression that suggested he spent most of his days dealing with minor traffic violations and lost dogs. He listened with polite disinterest as Chloe explained where they'd found the hammer. He took it from her, placing it on the counter between them. "All right, folks. I'll log it in the found property ledger," he said, reaching for a form. "If no one claims it in 90 days, it's yours if you want it." He was turning away when something in his memory snagged. He was only a teenager when it happened, but he'd grown up in this valley. He remembered the posters in every shop window, the massive search, the story that had become a local legend. The missing geologist. He looked back at the hammer, at its specialized design. He then noticed the initials A.T. Eris Thorne. His boredom vanished, replaced by a jolt of adrenaline. He looked up at the couple, his eyes wide. "Wait here," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. He disappeared into a back room. He returned a moment later with a dusty 3-ring binder, the cold case file. He flipped through the pages, past the faded maps and grainy photos, until he found the property list from Eris's pack. There it was, item number 7. Custom geology hammer, hickory handle, initials AT carved at base. The deputy looked from the binder to the hammer sitting on his counter, then back to the file. For 5 years, the case had been a ghost story. Now, lying on his desk was a solid, tangible piece of it, a piece that had been found miles from where anyone had ever thought to look. The ghost, it seemed, was finally starting to take shape. The geology hammer was sent to the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services in Salt Lake City, where it landed on the desk of Dr. Lena Petrova. Petrova was a forensic palynologist, a specialist in the microscopic world of pollen and spores. Her lab was a sterile, climate-controlled sanctuary, filled with the quiet hum of air purifiers and the glow of high-powered microscopes. To the untrained eye, her work was obscure, almost esoteric. To law enforcement, she was a magician who could make a grain of dust confess its origins. She began her process with the reverence of a surgeon. Wearing gloves and a mask, she placed the hammer under a dissection microscope. Her task was to find microscopic trace evidence that might have survived 5 years of exposure. The smooth metal and weathered wood offered little purchase, but she focused on the crevices, the seam where the steel head was joined to the handle, the deep grain of the wood, and the small space beneath the faint, carved initials. Using a delicate tungsten needle and a micro vacuum, she painstakingly collected the microscopic debris trapped in these havens. The sample was minute, barely a puff of fine gray dust in a sterile vial. This was the raw material of her science. She then began the painstaking process of chemical digestion, using a series of acids to dissolve the silica and other inorganic materials in the sample, leaving behind only the incredibly durable outer shells of pollen grains. The resulting concentrate, a few precious drops of liquid, was mounted on a slide. The principle behind palynology was elegantly simple. Every plant produces pollen with a unique size, shape, and surface texture, as distinct as a fingerprint. These grains are dispersed by wind and animals, creating a pollen rain that settles on every surface, creating a unique microscopic profile of a specific location and season. Because their outer walls are made of one of the most resistant organic substances known, sporopollenin, they can survive for millennia, perfectly preserved in soil, ice, or, as Petrova hoped, the crevices of a lost tool. She placed the slide under her scanning electron microscope, adjusted the focus, and leaned in. The monitor beside her flickered to life, displaying a strange, alien landscape of magnified shapes. She began to identify them, her trained eye quickly categorizing the common background noise, the spiky spheres of pine pollen, the smoother ovals of sagebrush, the triangular grains of local grasses. This was all expected for the region where the hammer was found. But then she saw it, a single grain, then another and another. It was a large, distinctly sculpted pollen grain. A shape she knew instantly, but which made absolutely no sense. It was Polemonium viscosum, commonly known as sky pilot. Her brow furrowed. She cross-referenced her botanical maps of the state. Sky pilot was an alpine wildflower. It grew only in very specific conditions, high-altitude, limestone-based soils almost exclusively above the timberline, typically over 11,000 feet. The wash where the hammer was found was at an elevation of 7,000 feet. It was a completely different ecosystem, separated by 4,000 vertical feet and miles of dense forest. It was a geographical and botanical impossibility. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Contamination? Highly unlikely, given her lab's strict protocols. Wind transport? Possible for a few grains, but she was finding a significant concentration, suggesting direct contact with the flowering plant. She reran the sample preparation. She used a different microscope. The results were the same. The hammer had at some point been in direct contact with a blooming sky pilot plant. The finding was a perfect, beautiful, and staggering paradox. The hammer was discovered in a low-lying riparian zone, suggesting it had been washed downstream, but the pollen evidence proved with scientific certainty that it had originated in a high alpine environment, a place completely disconnected from that river system. It couldn't have been in both places through natural means. The only logical conclusion was that the hammer hadn't been dropped in the river to be carried downstream. It had been in a high alpine basin, and then, at a later time, it had been moved by a human hand and deposited in the wash miles away. The phone call to the Summit County Sheriff's Office was one of the most unusual of her career. She was put through to Detective Isabel Rojas, a sharp, tenacious investigator in her late 30s who had recently taken an interest in the Thorn cold case. Petrova laid out her findings, carefully explaining the science, the pollen types, and the unavoidable conclusion. "Detective," she said, her voice precise, "the forensic evidence is unequivocal. This hammer was not lost where it was found. It was placed there. Its point of origin is a high alpine zone, somewhere above the tree line." In her office in Camas, Detective Rojas listened, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She stared at the old case map on her wall, at the sprawling, fruitless search grids clustered around the main trail and the False Dawn location. For 5 years, everyone had been looking in the wrong place. The entire investigation had been built on a false premise. Eris and Leo Thorn hadn't gotten lost on their hike. The pollen proved it. They had been somewhere else entirely, somewhere high, remote, and off the map. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one ever looked there. The case was no longer a tragic mystery, it was a homicide. The briefing room at the Summit County Sheriff's Office was thick with attention that hadn't been felt in years. Detective Rojas stood before a large, wall-mounted monitor displaying a high-resolution topographical map of the Uinta Range. The old search grids were still there, faded ghosts of a past failure. Overlaid on top were 2 new, starkly colored markers. A blue pin indicated the wash where the hammer was found, and a series of red circles highlighted the handful of high-altitude basins where botanical surveys confirmed the growth of Polemonium viscosum. "The old theory is dead," Rojas began, her voice cutting through the silence. "Eris Thorn did not get lost on that trail. The pollen on the hammer tells us she was up here," she said, pointing to the red circles. "In one of these basins. The hammer was moved later, planted in that wash as a deliberate misdirection. We're no longer looking for a lost hiker. We're looking for a primary crime scene and a suspect." The team brainstormed, their energy renewed, focused. The new theory was that Eris, an expert geologist, had taken Leo on an off-trail excursion to one of these geologically interesting basins. Something happened there, an accident or an encounter, and someone had covered it up. The investigation pivoted from search and rescue to a criminal probe. The new methodology was a painstaking trawl through decades of dusty records, Rojas and her team began digging through old property deeds, mining claims, and Forest Service cabin permits for the land in and around the red-circled basins. Most were empty, untouched wilderness, but one, a remote basin known locally as Thatcher Basin, had a single long-abandoned mining claim from the 1920s associated with it. An old, dilapidated cabin was still marked on some of the older maps. It was a long shot, but it was the only man-made structure in any of the target zones. Rojas organized a new search, but this one was different. It wasn't a massive army. It was a small, specialized team. Rojas, her partner, a forensic anthropologist from the state medical examiner's office, and a cadaver dog. They took a helicopter to a landing zone a mile from the basin. The cost approved without question now that it was a homicide case. The hike into Thatcher Basin was arduous, a steep climb through subalpine fir and then onto the open, wind-swept tundra of the high country. The air was thin and cold. The basin itself was breathtaking and desolate, a bowl of granite and wildflowers cradled by jagged peaks. The cadaver dog, a cheerful-looking Labrador named Buster, immediately went to work. Within 20 minutes, Buster began to whine and paw at a spot behind the crumbling remains of the old miner's cabin. It was a patch of earth that looked slightly different, the soil more disturbed, the vegetation younger and less established than the surrounding tundra. This was the nested discovery. The team began to excavate, carefully removing the soil layer by layer. 2 feet down, they found it. A small child-sized hiking boot. Then, the undeniable heartbreaking shapes of bone. The forensic anthropologist worked with quiet, grim efficiency. The remains were partial, scattered by time and animal activity, but there were enough. A skull with a distinctive dental filling. A femur whose length was consistent with an adult female of Eris's height. It was her. They had found her. As they continued the meticulous, heartbreaking work of recovering Eris Thorne's remains, Rojas noticed something else in the sifted dirt. It was a small object, no bigger than her thumb. It was made of wood darkened with age and soil. She picked it up and gently brushed it clean. It was a bird, a tiny, intricately carved songbird, its head cocked as if listening. It was clearly handmade, an object of folk art. It was not something a geologist would carry. It wasn't listed on the inventory of Eris's gear. It didn't belong to her. It was something else. A token. A trinket. A clue left behind by the person who had buried her here. In the profound, lonely silence of the basin, surrounded by the evidence of a 5-year-old crime, Rojas held the small wooden bird in her palm. The primary mystery was solved. They had found Eris. But a new one had just been born. Who had left this bird? It was the first tangible link to the human antagonist, the shadow who had haunted this case for half a decade. Imoriwariwar, Nemo. The hunt for the owner of the wooden bird became the sole focus of Detective Rojas's investigation. It was a classic needle in a haystack problem, a procedural deep dive into the quiet, often unrecorded world of local artisans and craftsmen. Rojas started by photographing the bird from every angle and circulating the images to her team. They began the slow, grinding work of showing the photo to anyone who might know. They went to weekend craft fairs in Park City, farmers markets in Heber Valley, and dusty antique shops in the small towns that dotted the base of the mountains. They interviewed wood-carving club members, art teachers, and local historians. For weeks, the hunt yielded nothing but frustrating dead ends. People admired the craftsmanship, but no one recognized the specific style. The bird was simple, almost naive, but with a distinctive way of carving the feathers and a particular tilt of the head. It was a signature, if only they could find someone to read it. The frustration mounted. The case, which had felt so close to breaking, was stalling on this one infuriatingly anonymous object. Rojas found herself staring at the photo of the bird late at night, trying to will it to give up its secrets. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. One of her deputies, following a hunch, had started visiting local nursing homes, showing the photo to residents who had lived in the area their whole lives. In a state-run facility in Oakley, he met an 80-year-old man named Arthur Bell, a former woodshop teacher with a mind still sharp despite a failing body. Arthur looked at the photo, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. The head tilt, he rasped, his voice thin as paper. That's Silas's work. Silas Croft. The name meant nothing to Rojas, but to Arthur it was a memory from a bygone era. He explained that Silas Croft was a quiet, reclusive man who used to live up in the hills. He wasn't a professional carver, just a guy who whittled to pass the time. Arthur remembered because Silas's wife, Margaret, had once bought a small lathe from him, and Silas had paid him with a whole box of these little carved birds. He said his wife liked them, Arthur recalled, called them her little souls. The name Silas Croft was the key. Rojas and her team rushed back to the office and ran it through every database they had. The picture that emerged was of a life lived on the absolute margins of society. Silas and Margaret Croft, now in their late 60s, he had no criminal records. Their paper trail was a portrait of quiet desperation. They had a history of deep rural poverty, of seasonal, under-the-table work. Medical records subpoenaed with a new sense of urgency revealed a devastating detail, a long and heartbreaking history of infertility, including several failed and ruinously expensive rounds of IVF treatment in the late 90s. Then came the final damning connection. A search of county property records revealed that in 1998, Silas Croft had used a small inheritance to purchase a 20-acre parcel of remote, undeveloped land. The property was legally accessible only by a single rutted dirt track. It was considered nearly worthless by the county assessor. On the map, Rojas saw its location, and a chill went down her spine. The Croft property abutted the southern edge of Thatcher Basin. Before the confrontation, Rojas built a detailed profile of her antagonists: Silas, the quiet whittler, the follower, and Margaret, the one who Arthur Bell said loved the birds. Margaret, whose medical records painted a picture of profound, untreated depression following her final, failed fertility treatment. A woman hollowed out by a grief so profound it had reshaped her world. The motive, hazy at first, began to sharpen into a terrifyingly human shape. They weren't monsters. They were desperate opportunists, broken by childlessness and poverty, living in isolation, forgotten by the world. And into their desolate lives, one sunny morning, had walked a woman and a beautiful, healthy 6-year-old boy. The shadow now had a name, a history, and a motive that was as tragic as it was monstrous. The drive to the Croft property felt like a journey to the edge of the world. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a deeply rutted dirt track that scraped the undercarriage of Rojas's unmarked SUV. The landscape was harsh and neglected. After 20 minutes of slow, careful driving, they arrived. The property was a testament to a life of making do. A small, dilapidated trailer home stood in a clearing, its metal siding streaked with rust. But next to it was a surprisingly well-tended vegetable garden, a patch of order in the surrounding chaos. A thin plume of smoke rose from a makeshift chimney. As Rojas and her partner got out of the car, the front door of the trailer opened. A woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. It was Margaret Croft. She was gaunt, her face a roadmap of hardship, her eyes wary and deeply tired. Behind her, in the shadows of the doorway, a man hovered. Silas, his shoulders stooped, his expression vacant. Rojas approached slowly, her demeanor deliberately calm and non-threatening. "Mrs. Croft? I'm Detective Rojas with the Summit County Sheriff's Office. We're here to ask you a few questions about a discovery we made up in Thatcher Basin." At the mention of the basin, a subtle tremor passed through Margaret's thin frame. Silas seemed to shrink further into the doorway. Rojas didn't wait for a reply. She held up a small evidence bag. Inside was the carved wooden bird. "We found this," Rojas said, her voice soft but firm. An old friend of yours, Arthur Bell, said it was made by your husband." The sight of the bird broke Margaret's fragile composure. Her face, a mask of stoic endurance for what must have been years, crumpled. Yeah, the fight went out of her. She looked from the bird to Rojas, and in her eyes the detective saw not malice, but a bottomless, soul-crushing weariness. "You'd better come inside," she said, her voice a dry whisper. The confession, when it came, was not a dramatic outburst, but a quiet, defeated recounting, a story that had clearly been locked away for 5 agonizing years. They sat at a small, wobbly table inside the dim trailer. Silas stood by the sink, his back to them, his shoulders shaking. Margaret did all the talking. This was the first barrel. "It was an accident," she began, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We were trapping, illegally, on the federal land in the basin. We needed the money. That morning, she just appeared, the woman, with her little boy. She saw our traps. She was a scientist," she said. She was going to report us. We would lose everything. This land is all we have." Her gaze was distant, seeing not the trailer, but that day. Silas, he panicked. He just wanted to scare her, to make her leave. He grabbed her arm. She pulled away, lost her footing. "There are so many rocks up there." She fell. She hit her head. She didn't get up. Margaret paused, taking a ragged breath. "We didn't know what to do. We were terrified. We waited until dark. We buried her. We took her pack and hid it." Months later, Silas took the hammer from her pack and threw it in the wash, miles away. He thought it would make them look in the wrong place. She looked at Rojas, her eyes pleading for a scrap of understanding. "It was an accident. We never meant for it to happen." For a moment, there was silence. The primary mystery was solved. A tragic encounter, a panicked cover-up. It was a story that made a grim, logical sense. Rojas felt a sense of resolution, the satisfaction of a puzzle finally pieced together. The ghost had been explained, but one piece was still missing, a 6-year-old piece. Rojas leaned forward, her voice dropping, asking the pivotal question that had been hovering in the air. "The boy," she said quietly, "Leo. He was with her. We never found him. What happened to the boy, Margaret?" Margaret Croft's eyes, which had been fixed on the table, lifted to meet Rojas's. The weariness in them was replaced by something far more complex, a fierce, desperate love entwined with sheer terror. The second barrel was delivered in a voice that was barely audible, a statement so shocking in its simplicity that it took Rojas's breath away. He's here," Margaret whispered. "We couldn't just leave him. We brought him home. We raised him. We called him Daniel." The confession hung in the air, a revelation so monstrous it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the small trailer. Rojas and her partner stared at Margaret, their professional composure shattered, replaced by a raw, visceral shock. Outside, a boy of about 13, drawn by the strange vehicle, was walking from the woods toward the trailer. He had his father's brown eyes and his mother's determined chin. He was carrying a small, carved wooden bird. The recovery of the boy who was once Leo Thorne was not a rescue in the traditional sense. It was a delicate, heartbreaking extraction. He was 13 years old, and his name was Daniel Croft. The gaunt woman crying in the trailer was his mother. The broken man being put in handcuffs was his father. The world he knew, a world of poverty and isolation, but also of a fierce, protective love, was being dismantled before his eyes by armed strangers. He was terrified, confused, and utterly berevering. The reunion with Ben Thorne took place 2 days later in a sterile, neutral-colored room at the Division of Child and Family Services. It was not a Hollywood ending. There were no tears of joyous recognition, no dramatic embrace. Ben saw a boy who had Eris's eyes, but who looked at him with the guarded apprehension of a complete stranger. And the boy saw a man with a kind, ravaged face who was claiming to be his father, a man who represented the destruction of his entire existence. The first words between them were awkward, halting. "I'm Ben," Ben said, his voice thick with an ocean of unshed tears. "I'm your dad." The boy Daniel just stared, clutching the arm of a social worker. The legal fate of the Crofts was swift and severe. Faced with the undeniable evidence and their own confessions, they pled guilty. Silas Croft was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years. Margaret Croft, for her role in the cover-up and the kidnapping that had lasted 7 years, received a sentence of 25 years to life. The news barely registered with Ben. His focus was entirely on the stranger who was his son. The aftermath was a landscape of profound and complicated grief. Ben had gotten his son back, but he had lost him all the same. The 6-year-old boy who loved to look for fool's gold was gone, replaced by a traumatized 13-year-old who mourned the kidnappers who had raised him. The boy, they were trying to call him Leo again, a name that felt foreign and strange on his own tongue, had no memory of Aris. He had no memory of Ben. His entire conscious life had been spent in that trailer, in that garden, with Silas and Margaret. He was grieving the only parents he had ever known, and he was being asked to love a father he had just met. For Ben, the joy of the discovery was inextricably bound to the agony of this new reality. He had spent years praying for an answer, and the answer was more painful than the not knowing had been. He had to navigate the impossible task of being a father to a son who didn't know him, while simultaneously grieving for his wife all over again, the finality of her death now a certainty. He had to help his son mourn the very people who had stolen his life, a feat of empathy that felt superhuman. The healing, if it could be called that, was not a journey toward a destination, but a slow, painful process of accommodation. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, Ben and Leo were walking in a park near their home. They didn't talk much. The silence between them was still vast, but it was no longer the hostile silence of strangers. It was becoming a shared space. Leo kicked at a pile of leaves, his movements still tentative, guarded. Ben watched him, his heart a constant dull ache of love and loss. He had found his son, but the truth had not made them whole. Justice had been served, but it hadn't healed the wounds. The final, reflective truth of his long ordeal was that some voids can never be filled, only circled. Yet you could not go back. You could not erase the years. All you could do was keep walking one painful step at a time into the complicated, bittersweet, and uncertain future, carrying the ghosts of who you were and who you might have been with you on the long walk home.